the final piece of our digital consumption method and digital heuristic puzzle, I want to briefly discuss the question of content moderation and increasing use of labels on content, especially by social media outlets. My aim here is to at once place the method within the broader context of other measures being taken to support us in our netizenship, and insist upon why, despite these measures, the responsibility for netizenly digital consumption ultimately lies with us. I've written at length elsewhere on this topic. In March 2020, exasperated, I reflected on the ongoing saga between social media firms, governments, and the general public. This is a saga which has seen governments struggle to work out how to regulate technology firms. It has also been a saga which has seen social media companies hesitant to moderate content more systematically on their platforms. How a few months and a global pandemic have changed things. As countries around the world went into lockdown and the scale of poor information surrounding COVID-19 became abundantly clear, social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook tentatively began to implement additional measures to manage the flow of bad information. On being interviewed by the UK national broadcaster, the BBC, in May 2020, Facebook's CEO Mark Zuckerberg proudly reported that up until that point, the company had issued 7,500 notices on poor information and applied 50 million warning labels on content. Then came the huge wave of criticism of Facebook's advertising model and its stance on political content. The hashtag Stop Hate for Profit campaign saw a boycott of Facebook by some of the world's biggest conglomerates, Unilever being one of the gang. Since then, and at the time of speaking, Facebook has raced to implement a number of measures across all the platforms under its guardianship. This includes WhatsApp and Instagram. In July 2020, for example, Facebook announced it was starting to issue global reminders to wear face coverings. A few weeks later, it announced the launch of its Facts About COVID-19 Centre. Meanwhile, to continue with the Facebook example, the platform has stepped up its efforts to use digital technologies to intercept poor information, including relating to the US presidential election. Great, right? We're using technology to beat technology. Or are we? But at least social media platforms, those outlets where many of us, especially in young demographics, get our news, are on top of the problem. Or are they? In fact, even if we have made welcome progress in the moderation arena since COVID-19 showed up on our doorsteps, the human skill of critically consuming information through lateral reading and research has never been more needed. The core reason for this, again to take Facebook, is that the content moderation techniques used require us to take individual responsibility. And this is due to, as I have been repeatedly underlining, the nature of social phenomena not being easily categorizable. Let me explain further. In the middle of 2019, Full Fact, one of the participants of Facebook's third-party fact-checking program, issued an independent report on the work it had conducted for Facebook. It makes for sober reading. Whilst it acknowledges the huge progress made and the importance of the program, it highlights a number of issues with it. One core issue, here it comes again, was the question of labels which Facebook had issued for fact-checkers to apply to content. As the authors of the report underlined, in practice it was often very hard deciding on which label to apply, not least because the labels used by Facebook didn't take into account the many shades that exist between what is true and false. Here is the big learning point, not least if we make the link back to education. In many school systems, we teach that a piece of information is either fact or opinion. That media can be fact or fiction. But as those whose very business is to sift through information have underlined, that rigid duality is simply impossible to apply to real-world content. To come back to the use of technology in moderation, this is also why we come up against problems. As Claire Wardle of First Draft has underlined, the complexity of information with its many shades is why we're such a long way from having artificial intelligence help us out. At the moment, computers understand true or false, or in other words, computers are only helpful when we have rigid categories. So far, so bad. Here is a good moment to also make a nod to some of the latest criticisms of Facebook. Let's imagine for a moment that the work of fact-checkers was unproblematic in terms of applying a label. It still remains the case that human bias might come into play, as indeed Facebook has been accused. In August 2020, online news outlets across the world reported on an alleged scandal which has seen Facebook relax or remove measures taken against right-wing information, whilst coming down much harder on content sitting elsewhere on the political spectrum. Whether or not these charges are true, what we do know is that it is incredibly challenging relying on others to make the judgment call. Even professional fact-checkers acknowledge this. The International Fact-Checking Network, which was established in 2015 to regulate the growing industry, has a code of principles it requires all members to follow. Across these principles, the common theme is an attempt to manage inevitable human bias. One of the measures to manage this is the requirement for all member organisations to use transparent methods of fact-checking. The reason? To ensure that users can replicate. And this is where we come in. In other words, what is advised at a top level is that for us to be really sure about a piece of content, we should go through a number of checks and balances, or in more generalised terms, engage in a process of critical questioning. There's also one other important consideration here, and where content moderation, as capabilities currently stand, is unable to help us. Mark Zuckerberg's figure for the first part of 2020 might seem impressive. This figure, however, represents but a fraction of all the content put online. As many commentators have called it, social media platforms often find themselves playing a manner of whack-a-mole, whereby as soon as they take action on one piece of content, more appears elsewhere. Meanwhile, there is a danger of moderating some and not all information. This has been labelled the implied truth effect, thus describing the situation whereby we consider anything without a label to be true. How wrong could we be? In sum, then, yes, we are not alone in the battle of enacting responsible digital consumption. There are aids at hand and some top-down initiatives in place. Ultimately, however, it is down to each and every one of us to acknowledge our responsibility to consume critically, not only for ourselves, but, as I will now go on to discuss, for others too.